So, how are the constellations affecting us in this now, respectively? And what could they be for us to understand them more? It seems as if they are a place in space in a certain formation. But just because something is presented to us on a face value level for, a model to be looked at in one way, when in a different formation it could be something of a totally different nature. Like, just because it's presented on a two-dimensional level, how all the constellations are just in a circle, it doesn't necessarily have to be like that. It could be like that. Could just be kind of like a distilled reflected version of how it has a resonance match for how it could like match up to a different formation. For all we know, the all the constellations, they could be in something of a spiral, or they could be something of like an infinity symbol, and how the constellations are just kind of dialed up. We could represent that within a circle, because obviously, whether we're aware of it or not, we're in a binary star. In between the solar system and the galaxy, the solar system is riding on a binary star, and within that binary star, the solar system and the constellations, it could be a micro binary star without us really realizing that. So, and within that micro binary star, we could look at the constellations from a two-dimensional point of view as, a circle. But on a different viewpoint, it's probably not necessarily like that. Those constellations are fixed places that are pre-programmed for a certain theme, that are, newly receiving updates per how it's going through the bigger microstar upon it on a different tier octave. So, and obviously, the beacons being the planets, being the material representations of the planets, because the planets aren't necessarily just their beacons. When their beacons go back to their constellation, then the head programmer is back in his room. So the head programmer sometimes leaves his room. The planets leave their houses within the micro binary star, but the houses and the constellations, they're still on a standby. So all the constellations, as the micro binary star moves in the macro binary star, the constellations and the houses, they're intaking and computing how they're moving from where they were at the start point to the finish point. And as they're doing that, the head programmers of themselves are having different combinations as they evolve from their material beacon objects. And they're re-implanting and updating through the evolution of this time from where we're coming from and where we're going to. When the head programmers go back to their house or their constellation, then that constellation is more activated. So what's more activated right now is, the pets, the work, the routines, the habits. The main programmer of processing and thinking is at its constellation and house, and how the constellation and house got created. So the constellation and the house that got created, Virgo constellation, of how it got created, whether the head programmer is there or not, whether it's on standby or not, it's more so infused, or it's more passive. If the head programmer is not there, then it's more passive. But if the head programmer is more there, then it's more active. So Virgo is more active because Mercury is in Virgo right now with the sun, and Mercury retrograde, according to like a book I just read, a retrograde, it's just an illusion where it appears to be going back, but it's a different, it's a different movement, oscillation wavelength, where the planet itself, when it's in retrograde, it's at its highest point in the constellation. So it's a different type of exaltation. So within that different type of exaltation, it's as if it's on the height or the rooftop of the constellation. So if there's a retrograde, if there's a planet in retrograde, the planet is in the height of that constellation at the rooftop of it. So it's at the rooftop, and since it's at the rooftop, the foundation is not necessarily being catered to. You know, the first floor, the second floor, and the stairs aren't necessarily catered to. It's just being looked at. It's just being looked at and observed. Mercury's just looking, when Mercury's in retrograde, it's just looking and observing how things are kind of more or less working themselves out. As the head programmer of that constellation, or Mercury in retrograde being in any constellation, it just being a general head programmer, it's retrograding and it's not doing its usual activities within the first floor, the foundation, the stairs, the second floor. It's on the rooftop. So since it's on the rooftop, it's not doing its general activities within how, you know, Mercury could act in any constellation, within how we're processing and thinking, just the general house outlook. It's not doing that. When Mercury's in retrograde, it's on the rooftop. So since it's on the rooftop, it's just kind of seeing how things are more or less self-organizing and more, you know, expressions of, you know, out-of-pocket nature and chaos could happen, Mercury retrograde. But as Mercury comes down and has a unique context dissension of its retrograde, and it comes back to station direct, then the processing and thinking of that constellation within the house of the constellation, a different context of the house, the structure of the constellation is then, we're then processing it more on a ground basis level, as far and opposed to, like, you know, going on the rooftop, you know. So as we're like, you know, so as the Mercury being in retrograde conjunct Sun in Virgo constellation, we're like, what Mercury's doing is just seeing how we're taking, you know, how the collective is taking action. Because when the sun is in is in the constellation, it's more so a collective influence first rather than an individual influence. And that collective influence is, you know, directing its light's refractions to the refractions within your house and your micro admin cadmin. So we're taking action, initiative, and we're also, you know, there's also an instinct element and a visualization element, respectively, to the sun. The sun is casting light on what we're visualizing, respectively, and how we're being exalted within our own characters. Sun exalted in first house. So we're seeing, you know, casually, we're seeing instinct, how to be ourselves within the collective routines, habits, and pet life, you know, because, you know, sixth house also has to do with pets. So it's like, you know, the zoo, you know, we're also caretakers. We're like custodians, respectively, in one sense. You know, everyone is a little bit of everything. But in regards to the Virgo constellation, we're kind of like, you know, the zookeepers, you know. So we're taking action for the collective zookeepers. And why we could have confusion is because we're digesting so much diversity. And within all the diversity, that there's a digestion process. So that's where the confusion could come from. Where we're just more or less, we're being focused. We're focusing on who we are. We're focused on our crown chakra from a human design perspective. Because Mercury and the Sun are aligned with the gate in the crown chakra. And the crown chakra, you know, casually equates to all the planets. But some more planets are more influential according to the material level. So in some esoteric astrology books, which I've read in like libraries, you know, a long time ago, you know, the sun could be exalted in the first house, and Saturn could also be like, you know, there's some material authority within the first house as well. So there's always this hidden Saturn element, because that's how the material reality is programming all the processes on a material, you know, quote unquote artificial level, in regards to how the earth is relating to the artificial intelligence simultaneously with the humans. So there's confusion because we're not necessarily knowing what Saturn the matrix is. We're not necessarily knowing what the sun is doing. We're not necessarily knowing how Mercury is kind of, you know, exalting moon energy in the material world. And we're not necessarily knowing all the other hidden influences that are kind of pushing and pulling us for our favor, and how we could be out of alignment with them based on just a lack of a particular type of energy work. So what's really going on here is, you know, Sun conjunct Mercury in retrograde in Virgo is things are being self-organized in a level where the head programmer is watching its own house do its own thing. You know, it's watching its own house that it created. It's like kind of like, you know, the baby and mommy, you know, mommy's there, but the baby doesn't necessarily know it, you know, but the baby is still kind of like in good hands, you know, but I know that's a bad example, but like, you know, mommy's there with the baby, you know, Mercury's there in its own house, you know, and, you know, a metaphorical baby, if you will. So, yeah, that's just kind of a casual spiel on, you know, how I'm just kind of like seeing like, how the Mercury retrograde is kind of like, within the particular gate in the Virgo constellation that somehow connects to the modern admin Kadmon body of your human design body graph. Gate 64 before completion. It's like the student is the teacher and the teacher is the student. This is major paradox energy. It's like the father is the son and the son is the father, because it's just like they're at a subtle transition point from spirit to matter. Things get reversed at that point, but that's where the confusion starts, where everything is switching its role, you know. And Virgo constellation, that it's beautiful that we can uncover that little insight, because as we're all switching our roles, you know, we're kind of gearing up to start a new, you know, academic school year. And as we're doing that, we're growing ourselves up to be the mature adult that we could be. And, you know, the adults that are, you know, above us in the material sense, they're just observing us and they're looking for the child for their own spiritual growth, maturity, and wisdom that they're lacking. So everything is in reverse and you know, and the Virgo constellation, gate 64, that exemplifies that. And we're taking instinct and action, and we're more or less seeing that within the start of this new year. And we're also like seeing how it could be processed in a good way. Seeing how, like, you know, the main programmer is there to like kind of like help us understand that, because if the main programmer is not in its constellation, then things are just kind of at a standby, where the constellation is doing what it's doing, receiving what it's receiving through its travels, and it's still doing its own fixed operations, automations, and network computations. But if the head programmer is there, then we could kind of ground that thinking energy all the more so, you know, within how Mercury has different subtle correlations within the human design body graph, because on traditional levels, some planets correlate and correspond to certain chakras, but on a human design level, all the planets could like have a nuance within any part of the human design body graph based on how the modern chakra within all the human beings got upgraded. But this is like a 50-50. On a different side note, this is all a 50-50 kind of it's all a 50-50 kind of you know, concept probability. And what I mean by concept probability is, if we don't know this, it's just going to go over our head and we're not going to utilize it for our benefit at all. But if we do know this and we work for this, then we could eventually unlock the potentiality of what the modern information is actually giving us. But that's the thing, we're not necessarily using it. We have to go through the process within the graduality of how the material beacons of the planets are in the constellations that they're at within the micro material binary star, and the spiritual beacons and the spiritual binary star are something of its own nature entirely that is subtly connecting it to the macro material binary star. And once the macro material binary star is connected with the spiritual micro binary star, then that's the first step in how we could, on a mental level, not necessarily a body and a spiritual level, that's the first step on a mental level, how to transcend, you know, the galaxy most respectively. So thank you very much. Mercury and Sun in Virgo oppose Saturn in Pisces, and the small possibility of the compromise of seeing how the matrix is bringing our focus attention to, you know, just the grand media, and more or less focusing on an energetic level, you know, the just the neutral energy rituals of, like, you know, Jupiter and Neptune being the ruler of Pisces, and the matrix kind of going towards that house to more or less compromise or be pulled between two worlds, to not see how, you know, Saturn in Pisces and Sun and Mercury in Virgo could work together. We're not necessarily seeing that, but we could. You have the best life ever.